A young girl fell in love with a man old enough to be her father, but it turned out she wasn't the only one. 2 other wives lived with them. How do you think such a polygamous union could end? Of course, the woman felt like she was losing her mind. She didn't want to share her man with anyone else. Chloe just wanted these outsiders to disappear from their lives. When her husband, instead of handing over clean clothes for the child, threw a dirty shirt picked up from the floor in Chloe's face, she couldn't take it anymore. She grabbed a butcher knife from the kitchen and locked herself in the room. The young woman knew exactly what to do. She just needed to rewind life, like in a movie. Chloe Driver was born in 2000. She grew up in Knoxville, Tennessee, along with her siblings. According to her parents, Chloe was a pretty young girl who had a happy childhood. As a teenager, she did gymnastics, played softball, did well in school, and had lots of friends. However, Chloe had very different memories of her childhood. She said her parents were very cold toward her. Because the family constantly moved from place to place, she never really felt like she had a home. When Chloe became a teenager, she completely went off the rails. She rebelled against her parents, stopped trying in school, started abusing alcohol, got hooked on weed, and experimented with a wide range of illegal substances. Chloe got involved with boys, ran away from home, and then, after having her fun, would come back. She felt like her parents didn't care about her at all. They showed her no attention, no love, no care. As a teenager, Chloe began self-harming and hid the scars on her arms under plastic bracelets so her parents wouldn't see. One day, she even tried to take her own life by swallowing a handful of sleeping pills, but then she got scared and sought medical help on her own. In the end, she was prescribed mental health treatment and given medication. However, she took the medication inconsistently, so her condition remained far from stable. When Chloe turned 17, she ran away from home once again, and this time, she never went back. That was because she met a person who completely changed her life. This encounter turned out to be fateful. The runaway girl was very young, vulnerable, and had nowhere to live. At the same time, she was struggling with a destructive addiction. That was when a 38-year-old man named Brian Jones appeared in her life, also known as Binyamin Ben Michael. In fact, he had many names, but to avoid confusion, we'll refer to him as Brian. Hey friends, we need your support to help YouTube promote this video. Please give it a like now and subscribe to the channel with the notification bell so you don't miss new videos. When you finish watching, leave a comment with your thoughts on the case. Brian was born in 1979, but little is known about his childhood and youth. When he turned 33, he met a 17-year-old girl named Gabriella. Despite the fact that Brian was nearly twice her age, Gabriella fell in love with him almost instantly. Unlike her peers, he was very charming, showed care and attention, and made her feel special and loved. He was a textbook predator. Their relationship developed rapidly. Within just a few months, 17-year-old Gabriella moved in with Brian, who was still living with his parents at the time. That's when she discovered that the man of her dreams already had a long-term girlfriend. They had been together for 2 years and were even planning to get married. But at some point, things fell apart, and now Gabriella was Brian's only partner. As soon as the girl became emotionally attached to her boyfriend, their relationship took a sharp turn for the worse. Brian worked in some kind of investment group that he had created himself. However, his company resembled more of a multi-level marketing scheme. Although Brian considered himself a highly successful businessman, that was far from the truth. He barely made any money at all. However, having his own business only inflated his ego further. He delved into religion and started preaching his own ideas about spirituality. He saw himself as a kind of messiah, claiming to have a higher level of consciousness than ordinary people and genuinely believing he was superior to everyone else. It was during this time that he changed his name to Benjamin and tried to indoctrinate Gabriella into his beliefs. He spent entire days reading religious texts to her, and eventually, he succeeded in pulling her into his system of faith. His next step was to isolate the girl from everyone she knew. Brian imposed restrictions on who she could talk to, what she could discuss, how long she could speak, when she could go outside, and how she should behave. She was given a set of rules to follow, and over time, those rules became stricter. Brian took control of her social media accounts, monitored her every move, and gradually narrowed her circle of communication. The only person she was allowed to stay in touch with was her sister, Nicole. But even their conversations were heavily monitored. Gabriella had to speak on speakerphone so Brian could hear everything and instruct her on how to respond to certain questions. In reality, he often texted her sister pretending to be Gabriella, and eventually, he confiscated her phone altogether to prevent her from reaching out to anyone behind his back. What was once a romantic relationship quickly became an abusive one. Psychological and emotional abuse soon escalated into physical violence. For breaking his rules, Gabriella could be slapped, kicked, or shoved. The abuse reached extreme levels, bordering on torture. One day, Brian took duct tape and wrapped it around Gabriella so tightly that she began to suffocate, but even that wasn't enough for him. He then started beating her, leaving bruises all over her body. On another occasion, he dragged Gabriella into the basement, tied her up, held a machete to her throat, and gave her a detailed description of how he planned to end her life. At that moment, Brian's father, hearing noises downstairs, came down to see what was happening, only to end up as his son's hostage himself. Then, when Brian's mother came looking for her husband, she too was pulled into the nightmare. All three, Gabriella, his mother, and his father, were held captive by a man who had decided to control the fate of his loved ones as he pleased. For several hours, he kept them all tied up in the basement, threatening them with violence. It's unclear what Brian was trying to achieve. Eventually, he simply untied them and let them go. And the most astonishing part? He got away with it. None of the three captives went to the police. Gabriella remained trapped in this unbelievably abusive relationship. When she turned 18, Brian decided he was getting bored of her and now wanted a new girlfriend. He had never officially married Gabriella. He had simply declared her his wife. Naturally, she was unhappy with this turn of events. She didn't want a rival in the house and told Brian that directly. Brian gave her an ultimatum. If she wanted to remain his only wife, she had to get pregnant within the next 12 months. The young Gabriella had no desire to have children yet, but she was incredibly vulnerable and knew that if she refused, Brian would follow through on his threats and bring a new bride into their home. Feeling trapped in this bizarre relationship, Gabriella agreed, and it wasn't long before she became pregnant. During this period, Brian hardly touched his wife, except for one time when he nearly strangled her for daring to contradict him. The rest of the time, he limited himself to verbal abuse. However, he decided that pregnancy was the perfect time for the couple to adopt a nomadic lifestyle. With Gabriella already in the late stages of pregnancy, Brian packed their belongings into a van and set off on a journey across the country. They never stayed in one place for long. The constant traveling and bumpy rides caused discomfort and physical strain for the pregnant woman. But that wasn't even the worst part. Brian rejected traditional medicine. He forbade Gabriella from seeing doctors or visiting a clinic at all because, in his mind, it was all part of the corrupt system he refused to believe in. By the end of her pregnancy, the couple returned to Brian's parents' home, and he finally relented, allowing the birth to take place in a hospital. Fortunately, everything went smoothly without complications. Gabriella gave birth to a healthy baby girl. However, as soon as she and the newborn returned home, they were forced to hit the road again, living out of the van and continuing their nomadic lifestyle. After the birth of her daughter, something changed in Gabriella. Now she wasn't just responsible for herself, she had a little girl to protect. She wanted to keep her child safe at any cost. In reality, having a baby gave Gabriella a newfound sense of confidence, and she began looking for a way out of her relationship with Brian. This was no easy task, as she had lost almost all contact with her family and friends and was completely isolated, except for the rare occasions when she spoke to her sister Nicole. But even these conversations were closely monitored by Brian. Gabriella had no money. She was with the father of her child 24/7, and she had no way to escape unnoticed. On top of that, they were living in a van, and since the baby was being breastfed, she was relatively fine. But Gabriella herself was barely eating. Her body was severely weakened, and she didn't have the strength to even attempt an escape. Despite Brian's promises, the birth of their child did not stop him from bringing another wife into the picture. While traveling across the country in the van, he met another 17-year-old girl, Chloe Driver. In many ways, Chloe was similar to Gabriella. She had also run away from home in search of adventure and was in a particularly vulnerable state when Brian found her. He courted Chloe in the same way he had once courted Gabriella, charming her, making her feel special. He succeeded in winning her over, and soon, the three of them, Brian, Gabriella, and their baby, were traveling from city to city in the van, now with Chloe as part of their unsettling journey. At the beginning of 2017, just a few months after their daughter was born, Brian and his wives stopped at a friend's house. In a rare good mood, he allowed Gabriella to meet with her sister, Nicole, though only under his supervision. The reason he agreed to this meeting was that Brian wanted yet another wife, and Nicole seemed like the perfect candidate. He had always liked both sisters, and as soon as Nicole arrived, he immediately began trying to charm her. For Gabriella, this was the final straw. She absolutely refused to let her sister be dragged into the same insane world that had trapped her. She didn't want Nicole to become another one of Brian's victims. Her fear for her sister gave her the strength and courage she had been missing. The young mother grabbed her baby, took Nicole, and used the opportunity to escape to a farm in Florida. She hid there for about a month before Brian tracked them down and dragged her and the baby back. Even after being forced to return, Gabriella never stopped thinking about escaping. But Brian threatened that if she ever left again, he would take their child and file for sole custody. The naive young woman truly believed he would follow through with his threat, so she stayed by his side a little longer. Gabriella endured this abusive relationship for about 4 years, but one day, her patience finally ran out. Now that there were 2 wives in their household, Brian wasn't as vigilant in controlling them. Seizing the moment, Gabriella managed to call her father and ask for help. Only when her parents intervened was she finally able to break free from Brian's influence and breathe a sigh of relief. However, for several more years, Brian continued trying to meet with her and influence her decision. He was furious that she had abandoned him. But one person was happy that Gabriella was gone. That person was Chloe. Now, she was getting more attention from the man she loved. But that didn't last long. Things quickly took a turn for the worse. After Gabriella escaped, the van traveling across the country now held only Brian and Chloe. And the once charming, attentive man who had promised to love her forever soon revealed his true nature, a cunning manipulator and an aggressive abuser. Chloe struggled with mental health issues and had a substance abuse problem. She had run away from her parents' home because she felt unloved by her mother and father. The arrival of Brian in her life turned her world upside down. He was caring, attentive, and made her feel special. Chloe fell for him instantly, despite the fact that he was old enough to be her father. For the first time, she felt truly safe and protected. But as soon as she let her guard down, everything changed. Brian revealed his true nature. Just as he had done with Gabriella, he began isolating Chloe from the few close people she had in her life. He forbade her from contacting her family, friends, or acquaintances. Any communication with others was strictly monitored. Then, Brian escalated to physical and emotional abuse. The cycle repeated itself, only this time with a different girl. After about a year of being with Chloe, Brian decided she was no longer enough for him. He still wanted multiple wives. And soon, he got his wish. 2 more women joined the van. One was 30-year-old Jessica, and the other was 20-year-old Sarah. Brian met them during one of their stops in a small town. He had a way of being charming and persuasive, and he managed to convince them to join his group. Before long, both lonely women had moved into the motorhome. The self-proclaimed spiritual leader declared Sarah and Jessica his new wives and continued his travels. Now, they were all living together in the van. Most likely, Brian never legally married any of the women. Instead, he simply created his own version of a polygamous union. And while polygamy is illegal in the United States, that didn't stop Brian from introducing all 3 women as his wives to everyone they met. To prevent a repeat of Gabriella's story and further tighten his grip on his wives, Brian drafted a contract and forced Chloe, Jessica, and Sarah to sign it. The document outlined how they were expected to behave and the punishments they would face if they violated the terms. Brian also gave all his wives new Hebrew names. Chloe became Kwani, Jessica was renamed Anna Gamani, and Sarah was now called Shelik. As for himself, Brian started calling himself Z. It's unclear what the internal dynamics of their relationship were really like, but on social media, Brian posted pictures of himself embracing all 3 women, and they appeared to be happy. According to one of Brian's former friends, there was never any jealousy between the women, and they all got along well. At least that's how it seemed from the outside. That friend was Jason Spillers. He and Brian bonded over their shared interests in investment business, as well as their belief that they were superior and more intelligent than others. Both men had a clear God complex and took pride in their perceived superiority. Their close friendship began when Brian introduced Jason to his bizarre spiritual beliefs, which Jason eagerly absorbed. Brian convinced his friend that he was chosen, and that if Spillers followed him, he would achieve greatness. Eventually, a 5th member joined the cult, moving into the trailer and adopting the same nomadic lifestyle as the rest of the group. But what exactly were these followers expected to believe? First, Brian forced them to follow a strict vegetarian diet. Second, he completely rejected modern medicine. The cult members were taught that they had to heal themselves, no matter what happened to them. On top of that, Brian introduced a practice of sensory deprivation, where he would confine his followers, sometimes individually, sometimes in pairs, in a room with no light and minimal sound. They were forced to remain in darkness for hours, meditating, without permission to even use the bathroom. But the most disturbing practice of all was urine consumption. Brian forced his followers to drink their own urine, claiming it had incredible health benefits. Naturally, as the cult leader, Brian believed that men should have multiple wives. At the time, he had 3, but he wanted more. Jason was also granted the right to have multiple wives, but at that point, he didn't have any, because Chloe, Sarah, and Jessica were already married to Brian. Both men viewed women as inferior beings, less than human, and treated them accordingly. Jason even expressed these views publicly on social media. He wrote that women were psychologically weaker than men and should be kept in cages. According to him, women were only capable of destroying what men built. He referred to the opposite sex as narcissistic and deceitful creatures. The only thing a woman could do that a man couldn't was give birth to a child, but some ladies weren't even capable of that. Jason, Brian's friend, also made a list of male superiority. He believed that women were incapable of taking responsibility, making logical decisions not based on emotions and flawed reasoning, properly leading a group of people or a community, ensuring the safety and protection of a family, thinking independently without succumbing to herd instinct, or being sincere. And these thoughts were expressed by a man who, at his friend's command, had been drinking his own urine for several years. The most astonishing part was that at least a few points on the list literally described Jason himself. It was Jason who had no opinion of his own. It was Jason who followed the herd instinct, obeying Brian. He was incapable of leading. The three women in the cult were treated exactly as Jason had described in his social media posts. They were oppressed, forbidden from having their own opinions, and not allowed to make any decisions. Sarah, Jessica, and Chloe were responsible for cooking, cleaning, and recruiting new wives. Everything else was decided by the men. But in reality, the only significant decisions were about which direction their van would travel. The funniest part was that Brian and Jason genuinely believed themselves to be chosen ones. Their egos were inflated, and they saw themselves as equal to God. But in truth, they were just two arrogant, pompous narcissists trying to elevate themselves at the expense of women. Sarah, Chloe, and Jessica were under the complete control of these two self-absorbed men. Brian was known for his cruelty toward those close to him, but Jason was no better. In 2017, before Jason joined the cult, he attended a youth festival and started harassing college girls who were much younger than him. The students tried to stay away from Jason because, to put it mildly, he was strange. After several failed attempts to start a conversation with anyone, he became enraged and began threatening the college girls with violence. Then he tracked some of them down on social media and started stalking them. For years, he continued to threaten them, blackmail them, and sometimes even showed up on their campuses trying to attack them. When his online threats didn't work, he turned his attention to the students' families, sending them vile messages. The girls and their parents reported him to the police, but the authorities did nothing about Jason's behavior. For a year, Brian's cult members traveled across the country in their van, occasionally staying at friends' houses. And then, something significant happened. Chloe, the first of the wives, became pregnant. Of course, this news greatly delighted Brian. Ever since Gabriella had escaped from him, taking their daughter with her, he had dreamed of each of his wives giving him a child. He saw this as a way to strengthen his control over the women. Just like with Gabriella, Chloe was not allowed to see doctors. She didn't register her pregnancy, and she even had to give birth without medical assistance in a random house where their van had stopped. Fortunately, there were no complications. The baby girl was named Hannah Nicole Driver. After giving birth to her daughter, Chloe's life changed. She hadn't expected to love the little girl so deeply from the very first seconds. Her views also began to shift. Before, she had relied entirely on Brian, never questioning his decisions. But now she started to rebel, because she was responsible for a tiny girl who had become the meaning of her life. The mother worried that her child wouldn't be able to develop properly in such conditions. Chloe was also concerned for her daughter's safety, which led her to question many of Brian's destructive and degrading beliefs and behaviors. She was frustrated that he refused to allow medical visits or necessary vaccinations. More than anything, she was worried about the infant's health. Because Hannah had been born in a random house, she didn't even have a birth certificate. She was completely off the grid. If anything happened to the baby, Chloe wouldn't even be able to prove that the little girl had ever existed. At some point, the young mother began to feel that everyone around her wanted to harm her. She started distancing herself from the two other women living in the van, stopped talking to Jason, and began pulling away from Brian. This did not sit well with the cult leader. Sensing that he was losing control over one of his wives, Brian began to punish Chloe harshly. He constantly abused her both physically and emotionally. Chloe was forbidden not only from speaking to outsiders, but even from greeting them or simply waving. She wasn't allowed to go to the store for groceries or take walks around the city. She couldn't get a job or obtain a driver's license. She was only allowed to use her phone in rare cases and always under her husband's strict supervision. The young woman felt completely alone, as if she would never escape the cult and never be able to live independently. To make matters worse, Brian knew exactly how to break her. If she disobeyed, he threatened to take full custody of Hannah. Over time, Chloe's situation grew worse and worse. Her already fragile mental health suffered due to the isolation, and the worse she got, the more Brian punished her. She was forced to undergo what Joyce called dark therapy. Chloe was locked in a pitch-black room, completely alone, chained to a bed, and not even allowed to use the bathroom. She had no choice but to relieve herself where she lay. When she emerged into the light, Chloe experienced hallucinations and began confusing fantasy with reality. Each time, her behavior became more erratic. Sometimes her aggression would spike to dangerous levels, and she would lash out at someone in the group for no apparent reason. But the moment she met resistance, she would start trembling and retreat into herself. Her gaze would drift, as if she had left her body and entered another reality. Out of nowhere, she would suddenly start screaming. Much of what she shouted was about her daughter, Hannah. The young mother believed the other wives wanted to harm her child. As a result, Brian and Jason often had to physically restrain Chloe until she calmed down. Chloe herself couldn't explain these sudden outbursts. She simply had no memory of them. In reality, she desperately needed urgent medical treatment. But because the cult members rejected modern medicine, Chloe never sought help. Brian took it upon himself to cure his wife's episodes, but her paranoia only grew stronger with each passing day. In 2020, the cult leader allowed Chloe to visit her family. He hoped it would somehow improve her condition and make her calmer. But that didn't happen. When Chloe's mother saw her daughter in such a horrific state, she was in shock. Chloe had lost a significant amount of weight since giving birth, and her eyes were lifeless. She looked more like a zombie than a happy young mother. A bruise had formed under her eye, clear evidence of Brian's physical abuse. Chloe's mother tried to bring her daughter back home, but she refused. She no longer knew where she truly belonged. However, the visit to her childhood home made one thing clear: she no longer wanted to be part of the cult. The young woman made several attempts to escape with baby Hannah in her arms, but each time, Brian or Jason stopped her. Chloe was reliving Gabriella's story all over again, but unlike Gabriella, her story, unfortunately, would not have a happy ending. In November 2020, Chloe managed to escape from the van and ran into the middle of the road. She waved her arms frantically, trying to stop passing cars. When one vehicle slowed down, the desperate woman rushed to the driver's window and began pleading for help. She screamed that she needed a phone to call the police and her mother because she and her daughter were in danger. The driver, a woman named Sandra, barely had time to react before two men suddenly appeared, Jason and Brian. They grabbed Chloe and began dragging her back toward the van parked on the roadside. The scene looked like a kidnapping. Sandra tried to intervene, but Jason simply walked up to her and punched her in the face. The result, a broken eye socket and a trip to the hospital for the innocent bystander. Meanwhile, Chloe was forced back into the van. After this incident, Chloe's mental health deteriorated rapidly. Her paranoia spiraled completely out of control. She became convinced that everyone was conspiring against her. She recorded a video on her phone, detailing how she was being held captive, how they had taken her daughter away from her, and how she was not allowed to see the baby. Chloe also started believing she could read other people's thoughts. She claimed that her husband, Brian, along with the other two wives, Jessica and Sarah, were plotting to take her life and Hannah's life as well. She believed the cult was performing dark magic rituals against her. Chloe became convinced that she was living in sin because she was married to a man who had two other wives. And in her mind, this sin was being passed down to her daughter through her breast milk. Around this time, one of Chloe's brothers was killed in a shooting. Now, she believed that God was punishing her for her sins, that she was personally responsible for the death of her loved one. Chloe also began sharing deeply disturbing stories about her childhood with the cult members. She claimed that at the age of 9, she had been assaulted by her own brothers. She later told everyone that her older brother was involved in drug trafficking and that she had been using white powder regularly since she was 10 years old. Chloe also complained that her parents had treated her harshly as a child, locking her inside a closet as punishment. As Chloe told these stories, she went into vivid, unexpected details. It was impossible to tell what was true and what was the product of her increasingly delusional mind. It was clear that she was suffering from paranoid delusions and could have easily fabricated all these horrors. One thing was undeniable. Chloe needed immediate treatment. Under normal circumstances, she would have gone to a doctor, received a diagnosis, and been prescribed medication, therapy, or some other form of help. But because Brian's cult rejected modern medicine, her condition deteriorated by the day. On the night of November 20th, Chloe's downward spiral reached its breaking point. She approached Brian and tried to convince him that Sarah, Jessica, and Jason had to go. They weren't real people, she insisted. They were hired actors sent to ruin their lives. When Brian refused to get rid of the others, Chloe was consumed by a wave of despair, her mind completely unraveled. She became convinced that everything around her was fake, an illusion, and that, just like in a movie, she could simply rewind to an earlier time, a time before the other wives, before Jason. But in order to return to the past, she first had to die. Chloe frantically searched the internet for ways to take a life in the name of salvation. She looked up methods to break a neck, inflict fatal injuries, and how to resurrect in another reality afterward. Her disturbing searches led her to various websites filled with horrifying information, which only pushed her further into the abyss. In Chloe's mind, the only way to save herself and her child from this strange, twisted cult was to end it all. At the beginning of December, Joyce's group stayed at the home of acquaintances in Canton, Georgia. On December 8, 2020, Chloe was already in an incredibly fragile state. That day, she was taking care of Hannah and asked her so-called husband, Brian, to bring clean clothes to change the baby. The man picked up the first shirt he saw from the floor and threw it at Chloe and the child. At that moment, the woman felt completely unworthy of life. After months of paranoid delusions, the shirt thrown in her face became the last straw and pushed her to the very edge. Chloe went to the kitchen, took a butcher knife, and locked herself in a bedroom on the second floor of the house with her 13-month-old daughter. Tormented by anxious thoughts, the woman did not even realize what she was doing. Without thinking, she plunged the knife into Hannah's neck several times, then collapsed onto the mattress and pressed the blade to her own throat. Chloe wanted to die with her daughter so that they could be reborn together. Brian and other members of the group heard something happening in the room upstairs. They tried to open the door, but it was locked from the inside. When Brian kicked the door open, it was already too late. Hannah, struggling to breathe, was making a gurgling sound. She was covered in blood. Chloe was lying unconscious on the floor. Suddenly, Brian let out a heart-wrenching scream. He never expected that the rebellious girl would go this far. He had always thought her antics were just a way to get attention. While he tried to press on Hannah's neck wound, his friend Jason ran to Chloe and attempted to bring her back to consciousness. At that moment, she was in a borderline state, drifting in and out of consciousness. When her eyes cleared, she quietly begged Jason to let her die. While the men were providing aid to the victims, one of the wives, Jessica, rushed to the phone and called emergency services. Baby Hannah was urgently transported to the hospital by ambulance. In the intensive care unit, doctors did everything in their power to save the little girl. But the wounds were too severe. One of the blows had pierced her spine. There was nothing more they could do, and at 3:10 p.m., Hannah Nicole Driver was pronounced dead. The girl lost her life as a result of a vicious attack by her own mother, and it was simply incomprehensible. Chloe was also rushed to the hospital, and unlike her daughter, she survived. The police tried to question the woman about what had happened, but her injuries were so severe that she was practically unable to speak. She had to respond in writing, and the first thing Chloe asked was to be taken to her daughter because Hannah was still so little and couldn't manage without her mother. At that moment, the officers had to deliver the devastating news. Her daughter did not survive. When asked if Joyce was to blame for this, the woman shook her head and wrote that she had done it herself. Then she added that she was losing her mind and no longer wanted to share Brian with his friends and other wives. She wanted to be the only one, but her husband did not listen to her. Brian Jones simply had no intention of giving up his polygamous lifestyle. After Chloe recovered from her injuries, she was placed in custody while awaiting trial. However, she didn't even try to use her time in jail to distance herself from her so-called husband, from whom she had once desperately wanted to escape. Instead, when she was allowed to make a phone call to her mother, she contacted Brian. During the phone conversation, her husband was very reserved, but he still continued to manipulate Chloe. He told her to keep drinking her own urine even in prison, and the woman actually followed his instructions, though she was ashamed to do it in front of her cellmates. Brian also forbade her from saying anything bad about him during the trial. While Chloe was in jail, she made about 600 phone calls to Brian, using every opportunity to dial his number. Meanwhile, the leader of the polygamist cult continued to enjoy his nomadic lifestyle with his 2 remaining wives. He was not charged with any crimes. On his social media, Brian announced that both of his wives were pregnant and that he would soon become a father again. Jason Spillers, a friend and follower of Joyce, continued to harass several college students and their families. In light of the Chloe Driver case, the police finally took notice of this man. They reviewed all the complaints from potential victims and issued a warrant for Jason's arrest. It turned out that he had escalated from making threats to taking action. In an attempt to kidnap a girl, he found out her address and showed up at her home. When he was not let inside, Jason slashed the tires of a car parked in the driveway and spray-painted the vehicle. Jason fled, but he was tracked down, arrested, and put behind bars. In November 2024, the trial of Chloe Driver, who had taken the life of her own daughter, was recently held. Throughout the trial, there was no doubt that the woman had committed the crime. However, the question remained whether she was sane at the time. The defense argued that Chloe should be found not guilty by reason of insanity. The prosecution, on the other hand, stated that Chloe had carried out the killing deliberately to become Brian's only wife. Various witnesses testified throughout the trial, aiming to shed light on the crime. Among them was Brian's first wife, Gabriella, who shared her painful experience of being in a relationship with him. The trial lasted 6 days, during which the jury listened to testimony from 21 witnesses and reviewed shocking crime scene photos before being sent to deliberate Chloe's fate. The young mother remained expressionless as her verdict was read. The jury found Chloe guilty beyond a reasonable doubt, but mentally ill on all counts. This meant that they rejected the defense's claim of insanity and held the woman criminally responsible for her actions. The sentencing of Chloe Driver, who sent her 13-month-old daughter to the afterlife, will take place in December of this year. Until then, she will remain in custody at the Georgia Department of Corrections. According to the latest reports, Brian Joyce has also been arrested, but authorities have not yet disclosed the charges against him. Did this young woman commit the crime without understanding what she was doing, or was this her way of proving something to her husband? If you have finished watching, you are a real fan of true crime. Subscribe to the channel, turn on the bell notifications, and put the like. See you in the next video.